York, this is Democracy Now!
I have met with him. He's bright, he's tough, and I have found that he is as they say, when he used to play ball, a worthy adversary.
President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin are meeting in Geneva for a high-stakes summit between the two world's largest nuclear powers.
And I generally agree with them that, indeed, there are some issues of mutual interest: strategic stability, regional conflicts, concern for the environment in a global sense. These are the issues in which we can really work effectively.
We'll spend the hour with Russian-American journalist Masha Gessen, author of Surviving Autocracy and The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in a high-stakes summit in Geneva right now for their first face-to-face meeting since Biden took office. Representatives for both leaders said they expect cybersecurity, nuclear stability, the climate crisis, Syria, the Iran nuclear deal, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and the Korean Peninsula to be on the agenda, and possibly the case of imprisoned nationalist opposition leader Alexei Navalny. The two heads of state will then give separate press conferences. Ahead of the meeting, Biden said the U.S. is not looking for confrontation with Russia. We'll have more on this after headlines as we spend the hour with Masha Gessen, award-winning Russian-American author and staff writer at The New Yorker. Israeli forces shot dead a Palestinian woman in a town northeast of Jerusalem earlier today. She's identified as 29-year-old Meafana, a doctoral student. The Israeli military claimed she attempted to ram her car into a group of soldiers. Local media report no ambulance was sent to care for her after she was shot. The killing came the day after Israel launched overnight air raids on Gaza for the first time since a ceasefire with Hamas was declared in May, following a brutal 11-day bombardment of the Gaza Strip. No casualties have been reported. The Israeli military said its air raid came in response to fire balloons launched from the besieged Gaza Strip. Earlier in the day, at least 17 Palestinians were arrested as they protested the ultra-nationalist Israeli March of the Flags taking place in occupied East Jerusalem. Some participants in that march chanted "Death to Arabs" and "May your village burn down." This is Palestinian legal activist and protester Farid Al-Atrash.
They should stop all the acts by the Israeli occupation and the settlers by entering Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the capital of the Palestinian state. We're telling Jerusalem and the Jerusalem residents that you're not alone, and there should be an end to all this aggression by the Israeli occupation in front of the whole world.
New York and California, both once epicenters of the coronavirus pandemic, lifted most of their remaining restrictions as infections continue to fall, and as over 70% of adults in both states have received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. Individual businesses will still be able to decide whether to keep their own health measures in place. The Senate has unanimously approved legislation that would make Juneteenth, the day commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, a federal holiday. The celebration dates back to the last days of the Civil War, when Union soldiers landed in Galveston, Texas, June 19, 1865, with news that the war had ended and slaves were free. The measure will now have to pass the House before it can be enacted into law. Lawmakers celebrated the historic move, but some called for further action. Democratic New York Congressmember Jamal Bowman tweeted, quote, "The Senate continues to be behind the times. Juneteenth has been a holiday for well over 100 years. Let's bring the Senate into modern times and get unanimous consent on abolishing the Jim Crow filibuster." In Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott has signed a controversial bill into law that prohibits educators from teaching about the history and social impacts of systemic racism in the United States. The law also bans teaching of the New York Times 1619 Project, for which creator Nicole Hannah-Jones was awarded a Pulitzer Prize. Texas joins several other states, including Arkansas and North Carolina, that have passed legislation banning the teaching of critical race theory since the police murder of George Floyd last year. Teachers across the country have been protesting the enactment of such legislation, which they've compared to Jim Crow laws. Democratic House members Cori Bush and Bonnie Watson-Coleman introduced a bill Tuesday that would decriminalize all drug possession and put in place a, quote, health-centered approach. Missouri Congressmember Bush said, quote, "It's time to put wellness and compassion ahead of trauma and punishment." In Somalia, at least 15 people were killed in a suicide bombing in the capital, Mogadishu. The attack reportedly targeted recruits at a Somali army training camp. At least 20 others were wounded. Al-Shabaab later claimed responsibility for the attack. This comes as the Pentagon's working on a proposal to deploy dozens of special forces trainers to Somalia to help local officials combat Al-Shabaab. In January, former President Trump withdrew some 700 troops from Somalia. In Hungary, human rights advocates are denouncing new anti-LGBTQ legislation passed by lawmakers yesterday that bans media, advertisers, and other outlets from showing children any content that portrays gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender people and prohibits teaching about LGBTQ issues at the schools. The far-right party of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán introduced the legislation, which was attached to a bill that more strictly penalizes child abuse. Opponents of the legislation have compared it to Russia's so-called gay propaganda law enacted in 2013. Human Rights Watch said the law, quote, "is a cynical attack by the ruling party on the human dignity of LGBT people for political gain. By falsely associating harmful illegal behavior with LGBT people, authorities invite hostility, hatred against them, fueling homophobia and transphobia," they said. After the largest expedition ever to the North Pole, researchers say Arctic ice is receding faster than ever before and that we may have already passed the point of no return on global heating. The expedition's leader, Marcus Rex, presented the team's findings Tuesday.
There are several tipping points in the climate system which lead to irreversible, sudden changes, which are triggered when the planet reaches a certain temperature. We have seen that we are on the verge of that tipping point, which will lead to the disappearance of the ice in the Arctic summer.
Back in the United States, water and land defenders in Minnesota are continuing resistance actions against Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. On Tuesday, activists blockaded a semi-truck loaded with drilling equipment lying on the ground and attaching themselves to the vehicle. At least 30 people were arrested Tuesday. This came a day after a Minnesota court upheld a state approval of the pipeline's expansion. The native-led group Honor the Earth said, quote, "Line 3 is a clear violation of human rights and cultural rights to live as an Anishinaabe people promised in the 1855 treaty. President Biden must stop Line 3, they said. To see our interview with Indigenous leader Winona LaDuke, go to DemocracyNow.org. President Biden named Lina Khan as chair of the Federal Trade Commission after the Senate confirmed her earlier in the day. Khan is a prominent critic of big tech. She wrote a widely held paper on the failure of antitrust laws to rein in Amazon while she was a law student at Yale. Senator Elizabeth Warren celebrated the news, tweeting, quote, "With Chair Lina Khan at the helm, we have a huge opportunity to make big structural change by reviving antitrust enforcement and fighting monopolies that threaten our economy, our society, and our democracy," Warren said. The Biden administration announced new measures Tuesday to combat domestic terrorism following a review of extremist threats and in light of the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. The new approach includes hiring more analysts and prosecutors at the Justice Department and FBI, improving communications on possible threats between the federal government and local authorities, as well as with social media companies. Attorney General Merrick Garland spoke Tuesday after the White House plan was released.
The two most lethal elements of the domestic violence extremist threat are racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists and militia violent extremists. In the FBI's view, the top domestic violent extremist threat comes from racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocated for the superiority of the white race.
Newly revealed emails show former President Trump, his chief of staff, and other aides pushed the Justice Department to back his false claims of voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election. The House Oversight Committee released the documents Tuesday, which show Trump and others began pressuring incoming acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen just an hour before Trump announced that William Barr would be stepping down as Attorney General. In immigration news, the Los Angeles Times reports the Biden administration is planning to expand a program that allows some Central American children to reunite with their parents living in the United States. Under the program, first enacted by the Obama administration, parents from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras who have legal residency or temporary protected status in the United States can apply for their children to be allowed into the country. This comes as the Biden administration continues to detain thousands of unaccompanied refugee children. Last week, during a visit to Guatemala, Vice President Kamala Harris warned asylum seekers not to come to the United States. Janitors, maintenance and security workers around the U.S. and the world marked Justice for Janitors Day Tuesday and are holding actions all week to demand safety, fair pay, health care, immigration reform, and respect in the workplace. In Miami, unionized workers have been on strike since last Thursday over low wages, pay discrimination, and unfair labor practices. This is Miami janitor Walter Osoris.
We need to work 2 or 3 jobs. Right now, I'm only sleeping 4 or 5 hours to be able to support my family. It's unfair. We want a better quality of life and for them to invest in us, in essential workers.
William Vanden Heuvel, a former diplomat, lawyer, and advisor to Robert F. Kennedy, died Tuesday in New York City from complications of pneumonia at the age of 91. Vanden Heuvel fought for civil rights, including during his time at the Justice Department from 1962 to 64. He also advocated for better conditions for incarcerated people, calling on the media to help shine a light on the failures of the criminal justice system. In 1972, Vanden Heuvel wrote, quote, "The right to know in a democracy frequently depends on the demand to know by the media." He is survived by his wife, his 2 daughters, including Katrina Vanden Heuvel, publisher and former editor of The Nation magazine. And the Goldman Environmental Prize announced its 2021 winners, recognizing grassroots climate justice activism across the world. Vietnam's Thai Van Nguyen, combating illegal wildlife trade and poaching. Kimiko Hirata is a climate activist working to halt Japan's use of coal. Maidi Bilal led a blockade to cancel 2 proposed dams in protected areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Here in the United States, Sharon Levine activated her community in Louisiana to stop a hazardous plastics plant from being built. In Peru, Liz Chique Churay helped found the Yaguas National Park, which protects more than 2 million acres of Amazon rainforest, and Gloria Mujica Komoto spearheaded a campaign which led the government of Malawi to impose a ban on thin plastics, a type of single-use plastic. She spoke at Tuesday's virtual awards ceremony.
Many countries around the world are regulating quantities and types of plastics being produced and used. But we're still drowning in plastic. You and me need to start making these policies a reality. We need to start making different choices, different decisions. We need to start refusing plastics and start reducing our part of the waste.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the Quarantine Report, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin are meeting in Geneva for a high-stakes summit. We'll spend the hour with the Russian-American journalist Masha Gessen, author of Surviving Autocracy and The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. She'll speak to us from Tbilisi, Georgia. Stay with us.
Ключ переломлен пополам, а наш батюшка Ленин совсем усоп. Он разложился на плесени, на липовый мед, а перестройка все идет по плану, и вся грязь превратилась в голый лед, и все идет по плану, все идет по плану. Захотела на покое, обещал и не участвовать в военной игре, но на фуражке на моей серп и молот и звезда, как это трогательно. Серп и молот и звезда, лихой фонарь, ожидание мотается, и все идет по плану. Все идет по плану.
Everything is going according to the plan by Igor Letov. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the Quarantine Report, the War and Peace Report. I am Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Nermeen Sheikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin are meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, for a closely watched summit between the world's two largest nuclear powers. Topics expected to be discussed include nuclear arms, cybersecurity, Syria, the Iran nuclear deal, Afghanistan, Ukraine, the Korean Peninsula, the climate crisis, Putin's crackdown on dissent inside Russia, and the U.S. military presence near the Russian border. Biden and Putin are expected to meet for 4 to 5 hours, but don't plan to hold a joint news conference, as former President Donald Trump did with Putin when they met 3 years ago in Helsinki, Finland. Earlier this week, Biden described Putin as a worthy adversary.
I'm going to make clear to President Putin that there are areas where we can cooperate if he chooses. And if he chooses not to cooperate and acts in a way that he has in the past relative to cybersecurity and some other activities, then we will respond. We will respond in kind. There need not be. We should decide where it's in our mutual interest, in the interest of the world, to cooperate and see if we can do that. And the areas where we don't agree, make it clear what the red lines are. I have met with him. He's bright. He's tough. And I have found that he is as they say when he used to play ball, a worthy adversary.
During a recent interview, Russian President Vladimir Putin expressed hope the summit would focus in part on areas where the countries share mutual concerns.
It seems to me the summit will help to restore contacts, relations, establish a direct dialogue, create a functioning mechanism for action in those areas that are of mutual interest. There are such interests, and I generally agree with them that indeed there are some issues of mutual interest: strategic stability, regional conflicts, concern for the environment in a global sense. These are the issues in which we can really work effectively.
Ahead of the summit, Presidents Biden and Putin have faced calls to restart nuclear arms talks. This is Beatrice Finn, head of the Nobel Peace Prize-winning ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons.
Well, these two countries, I mean, they hold over the 90% of the world's arsenals. These two individuals basically have the ability to end the world as we know it. And unfortunately, we've seen a huge deterioration in the the relationship between these two countries in the last 10 years. Since Obama and Medvedev negotiated the New START treaty, things have not improved after that. It's been lots of withdrawals from bilateral agreements, hostile rhetoric. We've seen a huge modernization and upgrades of nuclear programs, new types of nuclear weapons, new missions, and an increase of the kind of role of nuclear weapons in these two countries' security policies.
To talk more about the Biden-Putin summit and other issues, we're joined by the Russian-American journalist and writer Masha Gessen. Masha is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the award-winning author of numerous books, including The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, and most recently, Surviving Autocracy, which has just come out in paperback. Masha joins us from Tbilisi, the capital of the country of Georgia. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Masha. Why don't we start off by you talking about the significance of this summit, Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden meeting in Geneva, Switzerland. We are speaking as they have just sat down.
Thank you, Amy. It's good to be here. I think that this is an event that's more significant for Vladimir Putin. The very fact of the summit, the fact that Biden is, that Biden called him a worthy adversary, that he called him bright, that he's being treated as someone to sit down with and discuss the world. All of these are things that are incredibly valuable to Putin, and they are, unfortunately for him, an end in itself. Right? He accomplishes what he has come to Geneva for by simply having the summit. Biden is concerned in the sort of standard American idiom with deliverables, with finding areas of common interest, and he is alone in that. He's alone in actually trying to negotiate in good faith. There are also other significant distinctions between these two men. One is a legitimately elected president and a good faith actor. The other is a dictator who shores up his power by murdering his opponents, by jailing his opponents, and by rigging elections and dominating the media. He is not an illegitimate president, and he is not a good faith negotiator.
And Masha, Biden is the fifth U.S. president that Putin will be meeting. Putin having been in power for over 20 years, the longest time that any leader, Soviet or Russian, has been in power since Stalin. What do you think, and Putin having said, as we played earlier, that this is the worst point in U.S.-Russia relations, do you think Putin thinks anything substantive will come out of the summit, which is beneficial for Russia?
So it's a really good point that he is the fifth president, that Biden is the fifth president that Putin is meeting with. I think that these two men have very different sort of experiences of having the summit. For Biden, it is quite possibly the only summit he will ever have with Vladimir Putin. For Putin, it's a meeting with a temporary occupant of an office in which there is turnover. Right? It's a stop on a long and sort of ongoing journey, and I think a journey that he perceives very much, and I think quite accurately, as sort of a deterioration of American democracy. And here's another sort of stopover, perhaps a pause in the deterioration of American democracy. And Putin is going to have a talk with the person who's currently occupying the chair, right? So these are like perceptually very, very different things. What does Putin want to get out of it that's even more than just the fact of having it? You can see how sort of the normal mechanisms of participating in a summit have kicked in on the American side and have already given Putin a lot of the things that he wants. Right? Biden is talking about areas of mutual interest. Biden is talking about sort of discussing the world, perhaps discussing the Middle East with Putin. this reaffirms Putin's something that's incredibly important to him, which is this idea that you cannot do things in the world without consulting Russia. This has been a central theme of his presidency and of his consolidation of power. He builds it on this nostalgia for the greatness of the Soviet Empire, nostalgia for the superpower. And he spent a lot of the early decade in office talking about the ways in which Russia had been humiliated by the world, in which Russia is not consulted. Right? A breaking point in that sort of story of humiliation came 6 years ago in 2015, when President Obama, whose vice president was Joe Biden, could not get congressional support for intervention in Syria. Putin stepped in, published an op-ed in the New York Times about American exceptionalism, and said, I'm going to help Obama save face, and I'm going to take care of Syrian chemical weapons. As a result, we have a shored-up, or Syrians have a shored-up Assad regime. Putin stepped in, saved Assad, helped Assad save his stockpiles of chemical weapons, and demonstrated exactly what happens when the United States enters into any kind of agreement in an area in which both countries assert mutual interest. Right? So Biden talking about that, with that, we're talking in those terms, with that background, going into the summit, is a little happy moment for Putin, right? One that comes after a very long time of deterioration of Russian-American relations, both during the Trump presidency and in the first months of the Biden presidency.
And Masha, could you talk about what you think will be the mutual points of interest, as Biden indicated earlier this week in the lead up to the talks? He said that he would be open, for example, to a reciprocal agreement on the extradition of cyber criminals. Can you talk about the significance of that and what other points of interest and agreement there may be between the two?
Well, this is a really terrifying comment that Biden made during a briefing a couple of days ago when he said that the United States is going to raise the issue of the possible extradition of cyber criminals or people who are under indictment in the United States. And there are several dozen people under indictment in the United States for election interference, for hacking. And he said that there's a possibility of mutual agreement there, and that the United States would consider extraditing people who have committed crimes against Russia. And in my mind, I could hear the collective gasp of horror on the part of the hundreds, and there are hundreds, possibly thousands, but definitely hundreds, of Russian dissidents living in exile, many of whom have charges, trumped-up charges, pending against them in Russia. Right? And we know that the Putin regime was going to weaponize, and has weaponized in the past, Interpol warrants and extradition treaties to try to get to return dissidents to Russia. So I suspect that comment was made thoughtlessly, but the fact that it would have been made thoughtlessly 2 days before the summit by the President of the United States shows that I think he's not terribly well prepared for this meeting in some respects. And I'm afraid shows that the United States doesn't necessarily have the back of people who oppose the Putin regime.
I mean, this is very interesting, this issue of cyber warfare being elevated to the issue of nuclear warfare for the first time. And you have even Biden has not exactly said it's the Russian government who, for example, has been involved with the sabotaging of various major entities in the United States, but criminal entities, they say sometimes, that are in Russia. But they have this ability to attack these private mega corporations that don't have the necessary protection. Can you talk more about the power that the Russian government has, because that's what Biden is charging. While he's not saying it's the government, he's saying they have the power to crack down on the criminal organizations within their country. And the Russian push for years for a global peace treaty for cyberspace, what does that mean? Something that the U.S. has not accepted.
Well, the Russian push for a global cyber treaty is a push to create a set of laws that other countries would be bound by, and Russia wouldn't. This is how law functions in Russia, and there's no reason to expect that Russia would have a different attitude toward the law, toward international law. In fact, Russia doesn't have a different attitude toward existing international law than it does toward law within its own borders. Right? The law exists for Putin to consolidate power. The courts exist for Putin to consolidate power. The jail exists for Putin's opponents. Right? That's how the law sort of functions in the Putinite imagination. Now, as for whether these cyber entities are actual government agencies or not, Russia practices a system of plausible deniability, and this goes far beyond cybercrime. Right? It's the Russian government, in some significant ways, functions as a sort of syndicate, right, with a lot of freelancers. I think when we learn more about political murders in Russia, we will find out that there's a lot of freelance activity going on there as well, right? Certainly, that's how Russia has, on the rare occasions, then, that people who have actually killed politicians, such as Galina Starovoytova, who was a parliament member who was killed in 1998, Boris Nemtsov, an opposition politician who was shot to death in front of the Kremlin in 2015. On the rare occasions that someone has actually been prosecuted, it's always been sort of a freelancer, the gunman, who will not disclose who the original, the person who made the original assassination order was. Right. So I think that's, we're basically talking about a state that functions as a criminal syndicate, and that points to parts of its body and says these are not government agencies.
I want to go to Alexei Navalny. A news conference after NATO summit in Brussels, President Biden's asked how U.S.-Russia relations would be affected if Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny were to die in detention.
Navalny's death would be another indication that Russia has little or no intention of abiding by basic, fundamental human rights. It would be a tragedy. It would do nothing but hurt his relationships with the rest of the world, in my view, and with me.
Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin was asked on NBC News by Keir Simmons, did you order Alexei Navalny's assassination? This was Putin's response.
Of course not. We don't have this kind of habit of assassinating anybody. That's one. Number two is, I want to ask you, did you order the assassination of the woman who walked into the Congress and who was shot and killed by a policeman? Do you know that 450 individuals were arrested after entering the Congress, and they didn't go there to steal a laptop? They came with political demands. 450 people have been detained.
You're talking about the Capitol.
They're looking at jail time between 15 and 25 years. And they came to the Congress with political demands. Isn't that persecution for political opinions?
So that is Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking on NBC News. Masha Gessen, can you talk about this? You've written a whole piece in The New Yorker about Alexei Navalny and who he is and what's happening to him now in jail. But also this equation that President Putin is making with the insurrectionists that rioted at the Capitol on January 6th.
I've written many pieces about Alexei Navalny over the years. Look, I think that the world lasts long enough for the future to have his strengths. They will look at that NBC interview with Putin as a moment of just incredible shame. We know, right? And I want to go back for a second to the statement at the NATO press conference, because this is the kind of formulaic political statement that it makes people whose lives are actually at risk in Russia feel abandoned, right? So let's think about this. Biden says, if Navalny dies in prison, this is going to be another indication that Russia has no intention of abiding by human rights treaties, rules, whatever he said. Another indication? Like, we need another indication? After 22 years of this?
Masha, we're going to break because we want to reconnect with you. We're having a little trouble with your audio and definitely get back to this question. Masha Gessen, the award-winning Russian-American journalist, staff writer at The New Yorker. We will speak to them after the break. We're talking about the Putin-Biden summit that's taking place right now in Geneva, Switzerland. Stay with us. The old world. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest for the hour is Masha Gessen, staff writer at The New Yorker, award-winning Russian-American journalist, author of numerous books, including most recently Surviving Autocracy, which is just out in paperback. They also wrote The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, as well as The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. If you'd like to sign up for our daily digest, you can go to democracynow.org, or you can text the word Democracy Now!, one word, to 66866. There you will get our news headlines and our news alerts every day. That's texting the word, one word, Democracy Now! To 66866. You can also watch, listen, and read transcripts using our iOS and Android apps. You can download them for free from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store today. As we turn back to Masha Gessen, We are just fixing the sound. Masha Gessen is speaking to us from Tbilisi, Russia, usually in New York, where they are a professor at Bard College. But I do want to play a clip of Russia recalling its ambassador to the United States after President Biden called President Putin a killer during an interview on ABC with George Stephanopoulos.
So you know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm. I do.
So what price must he pay?
The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see shortly.
Earlier this week, President Biden was asked about Putin by CNN's Jeff Zeleny.
In a weekend interview, Vladimir Putin laughed at the suggestion that you had called him a killer. Is that still your belief, sir, that he is a killer?
To answer the first question, I'm laughing too. They actually, well, look, I mean, he has made clear that the answer is, I believe he has in the past essentially acknowledged that he was, there are certain things that he would do or did do. But look, when I was asked that question on air, I answered it honestly. But it's not much of a, I don't think it matters a whole lot in terms of this next meeting we're about to have.
So that was President Biden. We're going back right now to Masha Gessen. They're now joining us by telephone from Tbilisi, Georgia. Masha Gessen is writer at The New Yorker, award-winning Russian-American journalist and author of many books that I've just laid out. Masha, you were talking about Alexei Navalny. You have written extensively about Alexei Navalny, the longtime nationalist, clearly for many years anti-immigrant opposition leader in Russia. And then if you can go to this whole discussion
that's really,
that we just heard.
That's really inaccurate. And
why don't you say what you think?
Yeah, what I really think. Look, he's a pro-democracy activist. He is an anti-corruption activist. He has, many years ago, he made two really videos. Since then, he has clarified his position repeatedly. I have absolutely no doubt that he is a sick nationalist, right? Not a nationalist, and as a nationalist anti-immigrant activist, especially right now when he is in prison and unlike it's just not right? Actually, not right. But it's really possibly a mistake to make him journalistically to be him that way. We really need to be talking about a person, a pro-democracy who has survived an assassination attempt and is now struggling with an attempt to kill him slowly in prison.
Can you respond to President Putin clearly saying this is an issue of this is our own issue and this is not anything for the United States to intervene?
Well, Vladimir Putin is a Bolshevist, he is a man who ordered the assassination. And we really have to think that as journalists, we're in a bind, and because he is president of Russia. But what are we doing when we're giving them access to an international audience, asking this man who we know is going to lie on camera, who we know is a killer? There's ample evidence that a group of FSB, the Russian secret police officers, followed Navalny for several years and attempted to poison him, attempted to kill him Furthermore, there's ample evidence that this very same group has been following other people around and has attempted to kill other people and has succeeded in killing still other people. And we're putting this killer on national television with a journalist who's clearly unprepared to ask even a follow-up question and setting him up to make false equivalencies and to sort of bask in the light of TV cameras and in a chance to assert once again that he has the power, among other things, the power to speak publicly about a man he ordered killed while that man is in prison.
Masha, you've written...
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Masha.
No, I was just going to say that, every dictator under the sun, of course, says that every, that cracking down on the opposition is a matter of their internal politics. The whole concept of human rights is based on this pretty utopian idea that people have basic rights that are guaranteed to them by the world and that cannot be violated by a dictator who they have the misfortune to share a motherland with.
And because we're
Masha,
having trouble with the audio, if you could explain that parallel he's making to the insurrectionists and the killing of Ashley Babbitt at the Capitol on January 6th.
Well, this is classic whataboutism. This is when, and nobody is better at it than Soviet bureaucrats and former KGB agents. I think that this is a propaganda trope when everything is equal to everything else. And so he is talking about a politician who has been using peaceful tactics. The Navalny movement is really an extraordinary movement based on truth-telling and protest and nothing else. And he is comparing that to a violent, militant, armed insurrection in the U.S. Capitol that we know, again, this is well documented, had violent aims and engaged in murderous rhetoric. And all of a sudden, everything is equal to everything else. And the very fact that then we spend 10, 15 minutes trying to dissect that propaganda trope and trying to find a kernel of truth in something that is designed to obscure truth is a reason why we shouldn't be putting dictators on national television.
Masha, you've been following Navalny closely for many years, and you've written also about the conditions of his imprisonment. Can you talk about what you know of the conditions under which he's being held, whether he has access to his social media accounts, how he's communicating with the outside world, and the fact that earlier this year, as you wrote about, he went on hunger strike? Are there any prospects for his release, and how is he doing?
So we don't know a whole lot about how Navalny is doing, in part because access to him is getting more and more difficult. And the Russian parliament passed a whole special law banning all lawyers from bringing any electronic devices, such as phones, to their meetings with their clients in prison, specifically to prevent Navalny's lawyers from taking pictures of him or making videos or taking dictation and giving him access to his social media account. So he still gets some messages out. He can also send letters through the official censored prison mail. His wife, Yulia, was just yesterday, she was just allowed to see him illegally, in contravention to even Russian law, which is pretty awful. She has not yet been allowed to have a so-called conjugal, 3-day visit with him. She's only been allowed to have 4-hour visits with him a couple of times. So, which get actually cut down to a couple of hours by the time everybody is searched. So what we know about the conditions in which he is kept is that, first of all, Russian prisoners are kept in extremely poor conditions. Their death rate in Russian prison colonies, even not not during a pandemic, are extremely high. Violence is extremely high. Hygiene is very poor. Food is extremely bad, in part because it is supplied by sometimes by a company owned by Putin's cook and closest ally, whom Navalny has helped expose. So health conditions for all prisoners are extremely poor. Navalny's conditions are worse than those of many other prisoners, among other things because he is tortured with sleep deprivation. So he was placed on a list of escape risk of prisoners who are considered an escape risk. And so to make sure that he is still there, he is awakened by the guards every hour during the night. And this has been going on for 120 days that he's been in prison. He has also recently recovered from poisoning with the nerve agent Novichok, which sent him into coma in August of last year. We don't know what the state of health is for somebody who has recovered from an attack with a chemical weapon, which is what Novichok is. When Navalny was feeling unwell in March, he asked for an outside doctor, which is something that Russian law guarantees him, but he was not given access to an outside doctor, which is why he went on hunger strike. He called off his hunger strike as his health deteriorated, and he got some concessions, but not full concessions. But at least he didn't get to see his doctor, but he did get to see a doctor. Right now, we don't know a whole lot about the state of his health, but when he appeared in court a couple of days ago by video link, he looked absolutely awful. He looked skinny, he looked gaunt, he had bags under his eyes. He did not look like a person in good health by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, Masha, I'd like to turn to another issue which has to do with the pandemic, but in particular, the pandemic now in Russia, which has been reporting among the highest number of caseloads a day, and where, as a result of the levels of vaccine hesitancy, which of course we see here in the U.S. as well, but because of the levels of vaccine hesitancy in Russia, Moscow's mayor is now, much like in the U.S., offering all kinds of incentives for people to get vaccinated. So could you talk about this, the rise, the high number of infections now in Russia, the issue of vaccine hesitancy, and how the Putin government has dealt with administering vaccines to the population?
So I think there are two things at play, and this is really fascinating. It would be really amazing if we weren't talking about human lives here. But I think the two things that are at play are a total lack of trust in the government. So even though Russia was the first country in the world to have a vaccine, and it just it skipped safety trials because the entire population is basically a population of test subjects and went directly to making the vaccine available. But lucked out, it seems that the vaccine is safe from all available information and extremely effective. And yet, Russia has one of the lowest vaccination rates now in the world, certainly of countries where the vaccine has been available for any significant amount of time. Russia has been, Moscow has certainly been in the position for months now where the vaccine is available just for the asking. There are no shortages, and yet people are not taking the vaccine because they don't trust the government. But I think another reason that they are not taking the vaccine is because of the general sort of culture of a lack of respect for human life, which is also characteristic of this particular government. Under Putin, human life is worthless, right? You can poison an opponent. You can poison somebody just because they seem to have insulted you personally. I mean, the news that came out recently that apparently the poet Dmitry Bykov was also the object of an attempted assassination points to Putin probably taking sort of personal revenge because Bykov wrote an insulting poem about Putin or several of them. And so where human life is just worthless to the authorities, it also becomes worthless to the people living in the country. And in a sense, it's a rational decision, right? If you're risking your life just by living in Russia, not just because not only because if you're a member of the opposition, but if you're just a Russian subject, but just because of the disregard for public safety in every respect, why should you take the vaccine when any number of other things could kill you? It's not an entirely illogical sort of construction, unlike some of the vaccine hesitancy that we see in the United States, which is sort of pure conspiracy thinking. Right? In Russia, it has aspects of rationality. The government always lies to us, and my life is worthless, and I'm probably going to die soon anyway, so who cares? And as a result, we see extremely low numbers of vaccinated people. And even today, the Moscow mayor, you mentioned that he's offering all kinds of incentives. He also ordered that 60% of people in any service workplace be vaccinated. But we see how low that threshold is. 60% is not going to give anybody herd immunity. But that seems to be what he thinks he can realistically accomplish, and that's really depressing.
Masha, we just have about 3 minutes. We want to get to 2 issues. One, if you could briefly address the fact that you got COVID, breakthrough COVID, meaning you were vaccinated here in the United States, and then you got COVID. You wrote this powerful piece in The New Yorker called The Mystery of Breakthrough COVID Infections. And then I'd like you to end with talking about, what you have in the forward of your paperback edition of your book, and that is the U.S. moving towards autocracy.
Right. So very quickly, I did get breakthrough COVID, which is possible. It's extremely unlikely, but of course it's possible. We know that if the vaccine is 95% effective in preventing infection, some fraction of 1% of people who are fully vaccinated will get the infection. But fortunately, because I was vaccinated, or maybe because I was vaccinated, I had a mild form of the disease, so it was mostly sort of psychologically discombobulating because I thought I wouldn't get it, and I was still being quite safe, but I still got it. But I'm obviously much more interested in the subject of autocracy, and I think many people are awake to this now, to this sense that we continue to live in an incredibly divided country, where we have one party that is an anti-democratic party, and another party. The other party is trying to act as though we're sort of back to normal, and that imaginary normalcy is, of course, incredibly seductive. But unless we deal with what happened in the last 4 years, unless we deal with the reason we got Donald Trump in the first place, unless we reckon with the part of the country that has some really crazy beliefs, and with the divided reality that we inhabit, if we think of ourselves as a we, then I think we're enjoying a very, very short respite from a slide toward autocracy.
And we're going to talk more about your book, which is just out in paperback. It's called Surviving Autocracy. Masha Gessen has been our guest. We're going to bring you a part 2 at DemocracyNow.org. Masha is speaking to us from Tbilisi, Georgia. Masha is a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, award-winning Russian-American journalist, and has written a number of books. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Maria Tarasena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alkoff, Tamari Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud, and Adriano Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Marion Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, and Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Stay safe.